Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. The UN Independent International Inquiry on Ukraine released its findings this week on Russian war crimes being committed on a 300-kilometer stretch along the right bank of the Dnipro River, covering the Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, and Mykolaiv regions. The aim is to terrorize the civilian population and force them to flee their cities and homes. The method? Deadly targeted drone strikes on civilians. Over 200 civilians have been killed using these tactics, and over 2,000 have been maimed or wounded. In addition, over 3,000 homes and buildings have been destroyed. Also this week, Russia continues to make gains on the front lines. The situation is critical in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. It's hardly better near the fortress cities of Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk. While Ukrainian, U.S., and European sanctions will take time to bite the Russian war machine, there simply might not be enough time to avoid the capture of some key Ukrainian cities in the east. We'll discuss this with our guests, but first, these reports from Ukraine over the past week. This week, the war in Ukraine took a dramatic turn on the world stage. On October 27th, U.S. President Donald Trump made a direct appeal to end the fighting, proposing an immediate ceasefire along the current front lines. His message? Freeze the conflict, then negotiate. Russia's response came swiftly and with the usual defiance. On October 29th, President Vladimir Putin oversaw the test of advanced nuclear-capable weapons, including the nuclear-powered Burevestnik cruise missile, a system designed to evade defenses with nearly unlimited range. The timing was no coincidence. Moscow was signaling strength, not compromise.
We are meeting at a very important moment.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky remains open to talks, but insists that Russia must halt its advances, with Kremlin negotiators rejecting any deal that doesn't include full control of occupied territories. Diplomacy is stalled. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has released a report confirming extensive Russian drone attacks on civilians in the Ukrainian regions of Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk. The report documents deliberate strikes on civilian homes, ambulances, fire brigades, and other infrastructure, including dropping hand grenades on people in the streets and gardens, often captured in videos and photos posted on Russian Telegram channels, boasting of the destruction. UN humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine, Matthias Schmeil, said the war in Ukraine shows no sign of ending soon, with civilian casualties increasing by 30% compared to this time last year.
We have been through phases this year where there was cautious optimism that it might end. Right now on the ground, it doesn't feel at all like it's ending anytime soon. You also need to know that this year has been deadlier than 2024 in terms of civilian casualties, the 30% increase so far this year over last year. I think it's also important to take on board that this is increasingly a technological war, a drone war. Drone attacks are increasing.
Throughout the week, Russia hammered Ukraine with a relentless aerial campaign, over 1,200 drones and missiles in total, peaking with a single night barrage of more than 700 on October 29th to the 30th. Targets spanned 10 regions, from thermal power plants in Vinnytsia and Kyiv to substations in Lviv and residential blocks in Zaporizhia. At least 12 civilians died throughout the week, including children. Millions face rolling blackouts as winter nears. Ukraine's defenses downed roughly 70% of the incoming threats, but the sheer volume overwhelmed systems. Kyiv struck back hard and often. Ukrainian drones, mostly domestically produced, hit Russian soil almost every single night. An oil depot in Tambov on the 27th, the Ryazan refinery on the 28th, power grids in Oriol and Vladimir on the 31st, President Zelensky says that these strikes have crippled 20 to 25% of Russia's refining capacity in just days. In eastern Donetsk, the city of Pokrovsk has become the focal point of Russia's slow, grinding offensive. Russian troops are using infiltration tactics, small assault groups slipping through gaps, sometimes disguised as civilians. Under international law, that's a war crime. But it's working. Geolocated footage shows Russian forces inside southeastern neighborhoods near the central railway station. Ukrainian defenders are holding key strongholds, pockets within the city, using drones to strike Russian supply lines and counterattack. One failed Russian armored push near Dobropilya cost them a dozen vehicles in a single day. The front line here isn't a line at all. It's fluid, fractured, and house by house. Russian commanders claim that they're encircling Ukrainian units, while Kyiv says that the pocket remains viable. And now, joining us to discuss the findings from the UN Independent International Inquiry on Ukraine is the committee's chair, Erik Møse. Hello, sir, and thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine this week.
My pleasure.
Now, to, I guess, begin this discussion, can you please tell our viewers why is it so important to build a global evidentiary foundation for justice? How can these findings of the committee be used in the future?
This commission is a commission of inquiry, and like all commissions of inquiry, the purpose is to collect evidence of all kinds, look into the legal issues and form conclusions regarding legal findings, and then prepare the ground for possible accountability. The Commission is not in itself a criminal court, but it provides evidence which can be used in future criminal proceedings. The material we collect will then be kept very safe, securely in our database, and we will, on request, provide this material to judicial authorities, prosecutorial authorities, both international and international, and provided that the witnesses have given their consent to sharing this with such prosecutorial authorities. And that is, in a way, the gist of the task of such a commission. And as you know, this time we have focused on two issues. The issue of drones, where we found crimes against humanity, murder, and forcible transfer of population, plus war crimes, and also deportation and transfer amounting to war crimes.
Yes, now we've been following this drone story very closely, well, pretty much since it broke out, since July of 2024. Now, concerning the Russian side, are there any accusations against the Ukrainians, that Ukrainians are behaving in a similar manner, and is there any cooperation whatsoever from the Russian side?
There are such allegations on the Russian side, and of course we are an impartial and independent commission, and we look at both sides. We need, of course, to have access to territories, access to witnesses, and be able to ask questions when they need it. Unfortunately, the Russian authorities have chosen not to cooperate with the Commission. For that reason, we have been investigating these issues, but we have not formed any similar conclusion, any such conclusion as regards drone attacks with respect to Ukraine versus the Russian side.
Now, how about the committee's or the commission? Will it put forward a list of names of Russian commanders, military members, and what have you that could potentially be held, who are believed to be responsible for these deliberate attacks on civilians by drones, and when could this happen?
First, more generally, it is the methodology of this commission to collect names, both of individuals and possible perpetrators and entities. And we collect that in our database, and this can be shared on request. But in addition to that, we sometimes indicate in our reports which are the relevant persons or positions or hierarchies that have committed crimes according to us. So these are a two-pronged way, partly the list, which is not public, and partly in the reports where we indicate positions and entities with possible identification.
Is there a number of suspects that the committee has identified so far, and at what levels are they in the Russian military? How high up the command structure do these accusations go?
It's a large number. We have, it goes at various levels. We know for sure the identity of some drone operators, and we can trace this upwards to leading officers in certain entities.
Wow. Now, what sanctions may these individuals face in the near term once they're identified, absent any ICC indictment or trials in Ukraine? Perhaps international arrest warrant by Interpol, something of this nature?
Yeah. The most important, as you just mentioned, at the international level, you have the ICC, and at the international level, there may be this new possible tribunal concerning aggression, focusing on political leaders, but that's not yet established. So, but of course, at the national level, first of all, it's Ukraine, which have been prosecuting perpetrators in parallel with the war for a long time during this conflict. They have they have had cases, war crime cases of over 500 against 500 cases, and about 100 have been concluded. So there is ongoing accountability proceedings taking place. And this is what's going on in Ukraine. In addition, there is the possibility of other states, based on universal jurisdiction, to get information from the Commission and institute proceedings. So that is, in a way, the system within which this Commission operates, and we share information on request, as I just mentioned.
Yes, now we've all witnessed, many of us have seen these videos. I know we've put it on, some of them on Ukraine this week in the past. How can this, because this is truly unique, I think, in the history of warfare, that we have video of such crimes being committed. How does this contribute to actual prosecutions eventually down the road? Is this different than other types of war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine?
The drones are easily detectable in real life. They come, they hover over the villages, they follow people, they target civilians, first by bombarding perhaps the roof, then having pierced a hole, then a new bombardment, a new explosive through the roof, and then when people are have to go out of the house, targeting civilians. And in addition to that, there are attacks against first responders, emergency services, etc., and others. So there is a wide room for the population to film things. And in addition to that, the drone operators have themselves in their cameras, these embedded in their drones, these embedded cameras which film everything. And some of these films have been shared publicly, for instance, on Telegram channels. So there is a vast material on this. And as you just pointed out, it's a bit different from other conflicts and to some extent other crimes, because when it comes to, say, what's going on as regards torture in a detention center, for instance, there will be no publicity. So there are differences. But drone attacks or filming videos, they are not only relevant to drone attacks, but they play a role. And this is evidence which then a court will have to assess. And we are, before putting weight on such films, always assessing their authenticity and finding them credible in our view.
Certainly. Wow. It certainly is amazing. Now, finally, my final question, how likely is it that these perpetrators of these crimes will eventually face justice?
As I mentioned, some of them have already faced justice at the national level during proceedings in Ukraine. You have, of course, the ICC indictment, but now I'm talking more generally, not specifically about drones, but this is a general question, a more principled one. And these proceedings may take time. We all know that both international tribunals and national courts may have problems bringing people to justice, but experience shows, if you look at the great picture, look at, for instance, the Rwanda civil war, the ICTY, the Second World War, step by step, many people will be apprehended. That is, in a way, supported by experience. It will not always be done quickly. Sometimes it does, like in parallel with this conflict, but in other situations, it may take a bit more time. But generally, many will be caught, at least in the long run.
Yes, indeed. Well, it's a very important work that you're doing. I'd like to thank you very much. UN Independent International Inquiry on Ukraine Chair Erik Møse, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with the rest of your investigations. And I think everybody in the international community thanks you for your work. Thank you. And now joining us to discuss the latest from the front lines, among other issues, is former commander of the U.S. Army Europe, retired General Ben Hodges. Hello, General Hodges. Great to see you again. Thank you very much for coming on.
Hey, Don, thank you for the privilege. And I have to say, your previous guest, that was excellent. I mean, that really was a good report, and it's reassuring to see that people are doing that sort of investigation. Very, very important. So thanks for doing that.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've been on that story for a while now, and I mean, the tales coming out of Mykolaiv and Kherson, and they're on the right bank of the river, is really just horrible Russian war crimes. We're really happy that the UN is doing something about it. Yeah. Now, concerning our conversation, sir, we have a situation developing in Pokrovsk, in Kupiansk. Both of those cities look like they're going to fall very soon. And then we have the situation in the fortress belt in Donetsk. Russia's goal, we know, is to take the entire Donetsk region, to capture it all. How likely do you think that this is in the near future? And will losing Pokrovsk allow for maybe even better defenses, the fortress belt? And by that I mean Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinivka.
So it's been incredibly tough fighting in each of these places you've just named for months, and it's remarkable how long Ukrainian defenders have been able to keep the Russians out of Pokrovsk, for example, and so I'm not ready to declare or agree that it's inevitable that they're going to fall. But there's no doubt that it's a challenge, and I think what we're learning as observers of this fighting is that it is very difficult to hold terrain, especially built-up areas with just drones. You need manpower and lots of artillery and rocket capability to defend over these long fronts. Of course, the drones have played an important role, but I think in the defense, you still need manpower. And so this is where some of Ukraine's manpower shortages are coming into play, because obviously the Russians don't care about the number of casualties that they suffer. So I think that's part of what we're seeing. Now, I believe there has also been some frustration on the Ukrainian side that there's not been enough work done to develop second and third defensive lines behind these front lines. I don't know that. I haven't seen that myself, but it is always a problem in warfare when you're in the defense. Where do you decide? Do you keep what you have? Is it so essential that you defend it, or at some point do you decide you have to pull back to maybe a more defensible line? It depends on the importance of that area, obviously. My guess is that the Ukrainians will they'll know the best time to pull back if in fact they have to, but I would also imagine that they are looking for opportunities for counterattack where Russian forces are exhausted, extended, and perhaps vulnerable. So I think there's a lot more to come, but I can't predict how much longer this can go on there.
Right. Well, according to the latest reports, just as kind of you mentioned, Ukrainian forces are looking at an 8-1 deficit there in Pokrov. So maybe that has something to do with what they're expecting there. But let's move on now and talk about these Ukrainian imposed sanctions on Russian oil infrastructure and refineries. This has been extremely effective. The U.S. and EU sanctions are expected to deprive the Kremlin of tens of billions of dollars in oil revenues. But this will take a bite in some time. Yeah, it'll take a little bit for this to really start to cripple the Russian war machine. But what does this mean for the front lines? And does Ukraine have the time?
You know, I think the Ukrainians have developed or refined their theory of victory by going after Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, because it really is, it seems to me, the only way that Russia is able to stay in this war is by selling oil and gas to China and India and some other customers. So by targeting the entire infrastructure and reducing Russia's ability to export, I think that's going to have a significant impact on Russia's ability to keep fighting. Now, I don't know how much longer it will take. Some of this will depend, of course, on is Ukraine able to grow its own long-range precision strike capability to a scale greater than what they're doing now? Will the United States or other countries provide more long-range precision weapons which could be used against this oil and gas infrastructure? Will European nations begin to finally start taking steps to disrupt the flow of Russian oil through with the use of the Shadow Fleet vessels out of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea? All of these things are part of this effort. But it's interesting to me, Don, and I think your viewers will all appreciate this, that Russia's great strength over the centuries was the sheer size of the country. I mean, going back to the time of the Tsars, they could always absorb invading armies and then push them out or destroy them. Now, this vastness is actually a vulnerability because of Ukraine's ability to hit targets at enormous distances. Russia is not able to defend all of them. They don't have enough air and missile defense to protect all of the critical infrastructure and all the critical military targets throughout Russia. Ukrainians know this, obviously, and I think it was a smart move to target that.
Yeah, indeed. Probably one of the smartest asymmetric moves they've made thus far. Hopefully, as you mentioned, the momentum can continue. And I also think, I'll just say, I also think these are the most effective forms of sanctions. When we look at the politicians, of course, we know Russia has ways to get out of this, but when you send drones in knocking out very complicated refineries, they're not easily fixed, and well, this leaves no choice in the matter. But that brings us to the shadow fleet, which is still a present problem. Is there any way for Ukrainians to impose their own explosive sanctions on tankers shipping Russian crude?
Well, of course, I would anticipate at some point Ukrainians will be targeting these vessels, especially if they can get them in port while they are taking on oil, to be able to destroy them in the process of wrecking the export facilities, but to also destroy a couple of the vessels, so that whoever owns these things, the shadow companies or the shell companies that are providing them, will lose interest, because it becomes very unprofitable when two or three of them are destroyed in port. And this could also happen, of course, in the Black Sea. Now, this is not happening in a vacuum, and there will be, I'm sure there are concerns in some countries that if there is even more destruction of Russia's oil and gas exports, particularly the oil exports, how does that affect global markets? So this has to be part of nations working together to compensate for that, not to compensate Russia, obviously, but other nations that depend on that. So I think probably the right people are working on this, on how to approach this. But the bottom line is for Ukraine doing what they can to reduce Russia's oil exports, which generate the resources they need to stay in the war. I can imagine, though, the Ukrainians, they're not bashful, and they're very clever, and I can imagine that they will find ways to hit some of these ships far away from the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. I mean, even as they get out and try to transload to other more seaworthy vessels, I think the Ukrainians have quite a vivid imagination about how to do this, and I'm sure they will.
Okay, so not just limited to the Black Sea, that could go beyond.
Yeah, well, I mean, when they go through the Turkish Straits, then there have been reports that these ships would then transload the oil cargo to more seaworthy ships, somewhere in the Aegean, for example, and then they head on their way to India and China or wherever they're going. I could imagine disruption, and really we're not talking about trying to destroy every one of the ships, but if you can create enough disruption that it becomes unprofitable, or it slows things down, then I think they will do that. But I think there's a political, obviously there's a political and diplomatic element to this as well. More and more nations need to feel pressure to not tolerate these shadow fleet vessels. There was a report just the other day that even Lithuanian companies were refueling these shadow fleet vessels, which was astounding to me that Lithuanian business people would be involved in that, or that a New Zealand company was doing this. So we've got to, always the thing with sanctions, you have to really apply a lot of pressure on all the different loopholes and the gaps, and it's tedious, requires a comprehensive effort, or exactly as you said earlier, the Russians will find ways around it, and they will find willing accomplices, unfortunately, in Western countries.
Yes, well, we've seen Russia test these nuclear-powered Burevestnik cruise missiles. Russia claims has unlimited range and reports that Russia is concentrating also nuclear forces in the Arctic. Are there any alarm bells going off in your mind due to this development, or is this just typical Russian saber rattling?
I would say a little bit of both. Not alarm bells. I would imagine that our intelligence services have been tracking this development for quite some time. But, the Russians have a consistent history of talking about their nuclear weapons, their capabilities. And it's about every 2 weeks, Putin or Medvedev or Lavrov or somebody comes out and talks about we have this new weapon or we're doing a nuclear exercise. And all of these things are, of course, to constantly remind everybody, hey, we have nuclear weapons. I think that you of course have to take it seriously because they do have a lot of nuclear weapons. They do have capability, and they don't care about how many innocent people might be killed, including their own. But the likelihood of them actually using a nuclear weapon in any scenario other than survival of the Russian state, I think is very, very close to zero. And we have allowed ourselves in the West, including going back to the Biden administration, to be overly intimidated, to be blackmailed by these constant Russian threats, which prevented us from doing more to help Ukraine over the last few years. So you take it serious, but I really see this as the latest version of saber rattling. I like your phrase.
Yeah, and the media plays a role in this, of course. And I'm going to ask you another question about something we've seen in the media this week, the development of these Russian ground-launched 9 M729 missiles. That was the reason that the U.S. left the arms control pact with Moscow during Trump's first term. Now, in Ukraine, this missile has been used 23 times, including recently, even after the Alaska talks. How should we read into this? Is this a middle finger to the White House, or is this a natural consequence of Trump's withdrawal during his first term from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty? And if so, was this a mistake?
So I think this has nothing to do with the U.S. withdrawing from the INF treaty. Russia was in violation already. That's the reason that we pulled out of it. And of course, we were concerned about having capabilities to deter China as well. And China was not a part of that. So Russia as always, has violated treaties and will do whatever they think is best for them. I think that this is where part of the West, and especially the United States, making it clear that helping Ukraine defeat Russia is in our best interest. Making Russia live inside their own borders is in our best interest, the U.S. and all of Europe. Russia, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, constantly threatening the use of nuclear weapons and other long-range precision weapons that are nuclear capable. What they're doing, this should get universal global condemnation. So until we, the West, led by the United States, inflict real consequences on Russia, they will continue to give the middle finger. They're pretty sure right now that we won't do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, well, finally, General Hodges, dozens of leaders, political leaders, top military brass have warned that a war with Russia and NATO is inevitable in the next few years. Do you share this opinion, and what would likely be the scope of the war? Because, it's hard to imagine Russian forces unable to take Donetsk, as we just discussed, trying to march on Berlin or something of that matter.
Yeah. So I don't believe anything is inevitable. But if Ukraine fails, it will only be because we failed to help Ukraine defend itself. And then the rest of Russia feeling emboldened to take next steps goes up. I mean, they have said so. They have talked about Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe even Poland. So that's why helping Ukraine defeat Russia is so important. The best way to make sure there is no war between Russia and NATO countries is by helping Ukraine defeat Russia, which means giving them everything they need to help do that. Now, the impact of a Ukrainian failure and a Russian victory would be millions more refugees, Ukrainian refugees, going into Poland and Germany and the rest of Central and Western Europe. It also would mean thousands of trained Ukrainian soldiers would be forced into the Red Army. So the Russian army would get larger with more people to be used as cannon fodder against their will. And then, of course, if this has happened, the Russians would be reading that the West did not have the political will to do what was necessary to help Ukraine stop them, and that's where the risk goes up. Now, look, I do think that, and I take your point that if Russia cannot defeat Ukraine after 11 and a half years, why in the hell would they even consider attacking NATO? But their objective with NATO has always been to see the alliance fail. And the way they would do that is not like they planned in the Cold War to drive all the way across West Germany, but instead to create a scenario where countries in the alliance do not react to an Article 5 scenario, where the Russians might attack into Daugavpils in Latvia, or up near Narva in Estonia, or maybe near the famous Suwalki corridor in Poland and Lithuania, and then stop and say, hey, do you guys really want to get into a nuclear war over this little bit of land here? And if we are not willing to respond to that Russian attack, then I think the credibility of Article 5 would be severely damaged. And that's the scenario I think the Russians would want to create and would be even willing to attempt while they still are engaged in Ukraine. That's why it's so important that we stop their gray zone operations, what they're doing right now. We need to inflict consequences on them now so that they don't feel that they could even attempt that.
Yep, and first things first, victory in Ukraine. General Ben Hodges, former U.S. Army Europe retired general, thank you so much for joining us. Always appreciate having you on Ukraine this week.
Thank you for the privilege, Don.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Thank you for joining us, and join us again next week for all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Hope to see you then. Goodbye.